Hello everyone, welcome to Indian Economy by Aman Soni. In today's news hour, we shall be discussing the economic current affairs from the Hindu newspaper. In page 1, we have a news related to economy. The government has finished transferring its shares in Air India to the Tata Group. In 2018, the government opened bids for Tata. In 2018, the government wanted to sell its entire stake in Air India because there were no takers for earlier 76% offer. Finally, in September 2021, Tata Group and SpiceJet gave their bids, and in 2021 October, finally the Tata Group won the bid. And recently, the government has transferred all its stake in the Air India to the Tata Group. We need to know the basic timeline of Air India because there was a previous question in prelims regarding the timeline. In 1932, JID Tata launched the Tata Airlines, and in 1946, they called it Air India. And in 1953, Air India was nationalized, but around the 2000, early 2000, Air India started making losses, and finally in 2018, the Modi government wanted to divest them and wanted to use the money elsewhere. So that's the story about Air India. Let's look at the numbers. In the financial year 2021, the government set a target of 1.7 lakh crore for disinvestment. The Air India has around 77,000 crores of debts and liabilities, of which the government has agreed to absorb 60,000 crores. The government also has retained around 15,000 crores worth of assets which are non-core. So in effect, because of Air India, the government has incurred losses to a tune of around 45,000 crores. And as a part of the contract of disinvestment, the government has said that all the 13,500 permanent and contractual employees have to be retained at least for 1 year in the Tata Group before they can proceed further. That's the article about Air India. We can skip the city news. In the editorial page, there is an article related to economy, India's economy and the challenge of informality. The article says that since 2016, the government has taken many efforts to formalize the economy. What are those? It is demonetization, the Goods and Services Act, digitalization of financial transactions through the UPI, and enrollment of informal sector workers on various government portals to formalize them. All these are meant to encourage the informalization of economy. And why should the economy be formalized? Because the formal sector is more productive compared to the informal sector, and the workers in the formal sector get social security benefits which the informal sector workers won't get. But they go to question the premise of formalization. They say that the entire debate about formalizing the economy is based on the fiscal perspective of formalization, that is from the government's perspective. And this idea is advanced by the financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, who say that excessive regulation leads to informalization. That is, if the government tries to control too much of the business, they want to be informal. Say for example, if the government says if there are more than 10 people in a factory, all the labor laws would apply, then the MSMEs don't want to increase their number more than 10 people because they don't want the regulatory scrutiny to happen. So they try to remain small. This was also discussed, this idea was discussed in the previous economic surveys also. And the authors argue that if the formalization is going to happen, it should happen based on structural factors And what are those? Let's look at it. They gave the example of 1980s in India's tax reforms. They said in order to protect the informal economy, the government formalized only the large business entities. Thus, many majority of the labor intensive firms remained in the informal sector, and those informal sectors never wanted to be formalized again. We saw the example of remaining small so that we can avoid the regulatory scrutiny. And this led to a new arrangement wherein the informal sectors kind of formalized into a new arrangement wherein the large sectors would contract and outsource to the informal sectors. For example, take a large manufacturing hub, a company producing cars, and there are MSMEs who produce nuts and bolts. Instead of this nuts and bolt company becoming huge and expanding, it will remain informal, employing less number of workers. This huge company which produces cars, it will outsource and subcontracts the duty to produce nuts and bolts to this small company which is informal, so that they can have tax benefits. The small companies don't want to grow because they're getting various benefits like the tax incentives, and they can also avoid regulatory scrutiny. So this led to a new arrangement where subcontracting and outsourcing became common, and majority of the informal sector is labor intensive. And the authors also say, apart from the economic reason, there can also be some political and regional local reasons which can promote the informalization. Then the authors quote a study, Informality and Development, which says that it is wrong to just think that reducing the legal and regulatory hurdles will lead to formalization, because whatever is the government is doing, it is trying to reduce the hurdles. Just by doing that, the sector is not going to become formal, because informality is a sign of underdevelopment. Why the informality persist? Because the people in informal sector, they mostly, apart from the MSME firms which are there, most of the informal sector people are self-employed, and they even work from their homes, and they have very small business entities, and there is lots of inefficiency in the way they produce and manage their business. So the authors give the example of East Asia, wherein even though East Asia witnessed a rapid structural change in the 20th century, poor agrarian economies rapidly industrialized, drawing labor force from agriculture. But this labor force got absorbed into the informal sector, which is already low productive. Thus, the formalization just by reducing regulatory hurdles will not do any good, because whatever you have to do, you also have to take in other regulatory changes like improving the productivity of the laborers, improving the skill set of the casual laborers. The authors say the economy will get formalized when the economic enterprises become more productive through greater capital investment and increased education and skills that are important to the workers. The authors also discuss a crucial statistics where they say that just 9.7 percentage of workforce in India is formalized, and the periodic labor force survey says that around 75% of the informal workers are self-employed and casual wage workers, and the need of the hour is to focus on this 75% of informal worker and trying to get them into the formal sector. That's it about this article. Let's move forward. In the world page, we have an article related to economy. EU launches WTO case against China for targeting Lithuania. What happened was, Lithuania is one of the small countries in the Eastern Europe. It allowed Taiwan to open a diplomatic outpost in one of its cities called Vilnius. This outraged Beijing, who doesn't recognize Taiwan as a separate state and considers Taiwan to be a rebellious island within its mainland territory. So this led China to put sanctions on Lithuania, and they also replied with similar sanctions. Thus, the trade war between both these countries was happening based on the Taiwan issue. And finally, the European Commission took the news to the WTO dispute settlement, saying that China is wrong on putting sanctions on Lithuania. Now, both the countries have a 60-day window to resolve any issues. Further, they can move on the dispute resolution. Here we need to know about the dispute resolution mechanism of WTO and how it would be resolved. Let's move forward. India has seen boosting budget spending on infrastructure. Now the economy is having certain structural constraints. What are those? The private consumption, which makes up around 55% of GDP, is below the pre-pandemic levels because of the low demand and low income that the people are facing. And because of the pandemic, even though their incomes are not increasing, the expenditures are increasing on health and the livelihood expenditure. So the household debt is increasing. And because the spending is there, the retail prices also have swelled up because of various reasons, be it the increase in fuel prices or the general inflation that is rising. So because of all this, the economy is in a poor state. So the government has to spend more on the rural areas and on the subsidies and food fertilizers. And the article says the government will also spend on the transportation and health networks in the recent budget, so that the majority of the investments go into the infrastructure sector, which would ultimately create jobs and increase growth in the economy. This the government would do by giving production linked incentives to the manufacturing firms. In this article talks about the impact of the federal rate increase on the Indian economy. Bonds rupee weaken as Fed tone sparks outflow concerns. See, the Federal Bank in USA announced that it is going to increase interest rates in the economy. So what is the impact of this on the Indian economy? There are two investors who have invested in USA and in India. The investors think that at a certain rate of interest rates in USA, investing in India was a better option. Now that the federal government is increasing interest rates in India, the return on investments on the bonds in USA will increase. So the investors feel that investing in USA would be a better option. So what they would do, they would take out their investment from India and move back to USA. This will lead to foreign portfolio investments outflow. That is, the investments will move from India to USA. Because the investments are moving out of India, the demand for US dollar increases compared to the rupee. Thus, the value of Indian rupee falls in comparison to the dollar. Now, let's look into the article with this basics. Indian bond yield spiked with the rupee stock market falling to a 1-month low. We just discussed that if the foreign portfolio investments move out of the country, the demand for dollar increases and the value of rupee falls. That's why the value of rupee has fallen. And when the amount moves out of India, because the prices of these bonds fall, and falling prices of the bond leads to increase in yield of the bond because they both have inverse relationship. That's what this article discusses about. Now we don't need to read this article, this one. This Swiss gold exports article says that Switzerland is the world's largest gold refining center and transit hub. And in 2021, even during the COVID period, the gold exports to India almost went up to 507 tons from earlier 148 tons in 2020. This means more Indians are getting married during the COVID and the demand for increasing. The gold demand is increasing. That's one reason. The other reason being people consider gold as a safe investment. So they try to park their investments into gold for the unexpected future. And regarding this Ola Electric article, you just need to note the headlines that Ola Electric is going to set up a design center in UK. In text and context, we have a very good article related to the budget. Let's go through in detail. So what is budget? Budget is nothing but a government's blueprint on what are its revenues are going to be and what its expenditure is going to be in the coming financial year. And the article goes into details of the components of budgets. The budget is composed of mainly revenue, what the government is going to get, and expenditure, what the government is going to spend. So let's go into the details. Under the expenditure, we have capital expenditure and the revenue expenditure. Capital expenditure is nothing but that expenditure which is long term, which creates, that is, which increases the assets or which reduces the liabilities. That is, if the government invests on schools and hospitals, that is going to increase assets, and when the government pays off its long term debt which it has taken from WTO or IMF, it is going to reduce its liability. So that is capital expenditure. Revenue expenditure is anything which is not capital expenditure and which is incurred on those expenses which are less than 1 year. That is expenditure on government wages, salaries to government employees, the subsidies that it gives to the people, the interest payments which it makes on the loans, any grants which it gives to the state governments, everything comes under revenue expenditure. And depending on the manner in which it affects the different sectors, this expenditure is also classified in a different way into general services, economic services, social services, and grant in aid contributions. Expenditure on economic services and social services are together called development expenditure because they both lead to development of the country. And what are these economic services? These are the expenditure on transport, communication, agriculture, rural development, and allied sector. And expenditure on social sector schemes like education, health come under social sector categorization. And coming to the receipt sides now, the receipts can be either revenue receipts or capital receipts. Revenue receipts are those which are less than 1 year in nature. That is, it doesn't lead to an increase in the assets. So the revenue receipts can be further categorized into tax revenue receipts and non-tax revenue receipts. This tax can be further divided into direct taxes like income tax and indirect taxes like GST, etc. And non-tax revenues of government includes any fees that it receives from publications of government reports and books, any fines and levies that it gets from the people, etc. And in capital receipts, we have two categorization. One is debt creating and non-debt creating. Say if Government of India takes a loan from IMF, it has to pay back the loan after some time along with the interest every year. So this receipt which it receives for a longer time, the capital receipt, this loan is debt creating capital receipt. And what are non-debt creating capital receipts? Those are any disinvestment proceedings that the government gets from selling the public sector undertakings. For example, today we discussed the disinvestment from Air India. That is an example of non-debt creating capital receipt. And the difference between government expenditure and the revenue receipt and non-debt creating capital receipt is the fiscal deficit. Say when the expenditure is more than the revenue receipts and non-debt receipts, that is the fiscal deficit. This fiscal deficit shows what are the borrowings of the government. How much should the government borrow in order to finance its remaining amount of the budget. And if we want to know how much of this fiscal deficit are we using to pay back the interest on our loans, we need to look at the primary deficit, because the primary deficit shows that how much part of the fiscal deficit are we using to pay back the interest on our loans borrowed. If the majority part of the fiscal deficit is composed of primary deficit, it shows that we are not using the borrowings productively. We are just using the borrows to repay back our interest on the debt, which is bad for the economy. Revenue deficit is got by deducting the capital expenditure from fiscal deficit. Now, what are the implications of a budget for an economy? The budget has implication for the overall demand in the economy, because if the government goes for more spending, it will lead to more increase in the aggregate demand in the economy. If the government goes for contractionary fiscal policy, that is, it tries to reduce its funding in the economy by increasing taxes and reducing its expenses, the aggregate demand will reduce in the economy. And it also has implications for income distribution, because if the government directly gives subsidies and other benefits to the poor people, it increases the amount in the hands of the poor. But if the government reduces the corporate tax, it directly affects the rich people more than the poor people. So the budget also has implications for income distribution in the economy. Now, every game has certain rules to play. If you want to play a game, you need to follow the rules to play. Similarly, even the budget formulation has certain rules which has to be followed. Those are called the fiscal rules. And every country has different unique tailor-made rules for its economy. And in India, we have policy targets given by the NK Singh committee report, which says that you have to follow these rules when you are formulating your budget, and you have to bring back your deficit to this percentage within so many years to maintain the productivity in the economy. And what are those three targets, policy targets that were submitted by the NK Singh committee? They are the debt to GDP ratio, physical deficit to GDP ratio, that is how much debt should we take as a percentage of GDP. We have a target of reducing it to around 70%. And the physical deficit GDP ratio, now we have increased because of COVID, otherwise it would have been 4% and 4.5%. So the authors finally say that sometimes these policy targets that we have, the deficit targets that we have, are so strict that it may not give any room for changing the budget policy even during exceptional circumstances. And under the FRBM Act, we have exceptions, but the government should be free to increase its spending. These fiscal rules put certain constraints on the government when formulating the budget, because the fiscal rules make it compulsory for the government to follow them Even under some exceptional circumstances, they have to come back to the required amount of physical deficit under certain period of time, and the government doesn't have too much freedom to increase or decrease its spending. So there is a need to recheck our physical deficit targets. Moving forward, there is one more article related to the federal government increase of tax interest rates and the effect on the other economies. It says that the US government recently said that it's going to increase its interest rates, and what are the effects on the stock prices and the bond yields. Let's look. Every central bank would play with the interest rate so that they can regulate the money supply within the economy. And when the central banks try to reduce the money supply, they increase the interest rates. When they increase the interest rate, it shows to the people that the future liquidity in the market is going to be less, and if the people are going to feel that the central bank is not going to purchase back the bonds at a higher rate in future, they're not going to speculate with those bonds, they're not going to purchase those bonds, so the demand for the bonds will fall. And when the demand for the bonds fall, the yields of the same bonds increases. Let's recap. If people demand the bonds less, the price of the bond falls. If the price falls, the yield increases, because both prices and yields have inverse relations. And the article also discusses that even the stock prices and the bond yields are inversely related, because when the interest rates on a bond falls from say 5% to 1%, the investors feel that the return is not going to be enough. So what they'll do, they'll start selling the bonds and they'll start investing that money into the stocks, that is the shares. So a fall in interest rate of the bonds would lead to an increase in demand for the shares, and the prices of the shares increases. And finally, the authors end the article by saying that it's not always the interest rates that influence the prices of the stocks. There can also be other factors like the earnings expectations that influence the stock prices. If the people feel that the company is not going to perform well in the future, they are not going to invest in those type of stocks, so the prices of those stocks will fall. And even an economy can be overvalued or undervalued for even a long period of time, and they go through regular corrections. That is, if the stock market is overvalued, finally everyone will realize that they have put their money in wrong places, and they'll start taking out their money from the stock market, and the stock market will fall and it will adjust to the real values. That's how the stock market works over a period of long time. That finishes this article, and there is nothing in this page related to economy. This finishes our discussion on News Hour today. Thank you.